are confronted with someone who doesn't believe in civil rights for foreign narco-terrorists who are not American citizens, the very first thing that comes to mind is not a rational argument. It's not a clever retort. Instead, they simply ask, have you read To Kill a Mockingbird?
So, that was right-wing ghoul and man whose beard is doing a lot of heavy lifting, Matt Walsh, talking about the Trump administration's recent bombing of a Venezuelan speedboat suspected of carrying drugs to the U.S. On September 2nd, Trump announced the military strike at an Oval Office event, then later said on Truth Social that 11 Venezuelans were killed, all members of Tren de Aragua. As you can imagine, this action on the part of Trump and the military was highly controversial. Immediate questions sprang up about the very legality of the strike. As Matt Walsh pointed out in his video, Brian Krasenstein called the strike a war crime, and couch enthusiast JD Vance said, "I don't give a shit what you call it." And just adding on to the controversy, the New York Times and CBS reported that the boat was turning back before it was struck. But beyond the legality of the strike, there's still the question of whether the boat actually was a drug boat, whether the 11 Venezuelans killed were actually Tren de Aragua members, and whether those Venezuelans were committing any crime at all. As Krasenstein rightfully pointed out, that's why we have due process in the first place. As PBS reported, Senator Jim Risch of Idaho, the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said he is extremely confident that the target of the boat bombing was a group of narco-terrorists. "I can't tell you how many lives were saved by the President of the United States when he pulled the trigger on that," Risch said Tuesday. "There were tons of drugs that went down with that would have wound up right here in the USA."
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the f*** up.
Okay, in fairness, maybe Senator Jim Risch has information that we don't, but still, even if he has all the information that the Pentagon and the White House do, he can still only say that he is extremely confident. I shouldn't have to point out how that leaves room for error, right? This is why we have trials, this is why we have due process, this is why Americans are terrified right now. If Trump can justify executing inbound foreigners without a trial, what's to stop him from doing the same to people here in the United States? Whether they were born here or not, whether they're here legally, illegally, doesn't matter. As long as someone with enough power is, quote, extremely confident, you committed a crime. Now, it should come as no surprise to you that Walsh just takes it as a given that these were for sure drug traffickers, and he implicitly agrees that the people who were killed were not entitled to due process. But you might be thinking, what does this have to do with To Kill a Mockingbird? Well, Senator Rand Paul, chair of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, took clear issue with Vance's comments and asked in a tweet, did he ever read To Kill a Mockingbird? Did he ever wonder what might happen if the accused were immediately executed without trial or representation? What a despicable and thoughtless sentiment it is to glorify killing someone without a trial. And keep in mind, Paul is a Republican. This is someone who, in general, is on Vance's side. Once Walsh brings up Paul's tweet, he immediately starts trying to belittle To Kill a Mockingbird.
I should make it clear that To Kill a Mockingbird is a work of fiction, and it's written at a child's reading level. And it was written by some random woman who invented a story in her head. It's not a documentary. It's not a textbook on constitutional law. It's certainly not a manual for how to approach drug cartels. It's a dumb story, and not an especially well-written one either.
Hey Matt, you know what else is a work of fiction that's written for a child audience? Your own book, Johnny the Walrus. But I guess we should throw that one out too, shouldn't we, seeing as works of fiction for young audiences aren't worth a thing. It's such a transparently bad faith argument. The idea that fiction couldn't possibly be relevant to us, even and especially in political discourse, is the type of anti-intellectualism that Matt just loves, and we'll see more of it as we go on. Matt also says that everyone is assigned to read this book in school and nobody would read it unless it were assigned. On September 14th, I put out a poll to my audience asking if they'd read To Kill a Mockingbird and under what conditions. At the time of writing this video, 3,500 people have responded. Now, while 44% of people did read it in school, 13% read it of their own accord outside of school, and 41% never had it assigned to them at all. Granted, as commenters on that post pointed out, the entirety of my audience isn't American, but I doubt the entire 41% there is non-Americans. What's more, I will say, this wasn't a random sample or anything, and maybe you think 3,500 people isn't statistically significant, which is fair, but I think this poll still shows how generally wrong Matt is already. I can be prone to hyperbole and making mountains out of molehills, but this is just ridiculous. I'll agree with him in a broad sense that there are certain classics we probably wouldn't read anymore if they'd had no societal or historical impact. Our tastes in literature evolve over time, but I'd argue To Kill a Mockingbird is still a pretty good read by today's standards. Walsh continues his strange vendetta against the book, saying,
Now, it's true that for generations, To Kill a Mockingbird has always had the full backing of every establishment institution in the country. Every school and government relentlessly pushed the book on young people as soon as it was published in 1960. It won a Pulitzer within a year of its release. A group of librarians in Britain declared that To Kill a Mockingbird was just as important as the Bible, This book was force-fed on everyone, just like that U2 album that Apple installed on everybody's phone without their permission several years ago. That doesn't mean that the book is any good. And it certainly doesn't mean that the book is relevant to a foreign policy debate with JD Vance.
Now, I'll again agree with Matt on this point. A book's accolades do not necessarily determine its quality. To Kill a Mockingbird won a Pulitzer, but that alone does not make it a good book. And that's where my agreements with Walsh end. The Pulitzer should at least communicate something about how the book was received at the time, and there is value in that, even if it doesn't inherently imply the book's quality, then or now. Moreover, I guess Walsh thinks the book is propaganda because a lot of schools teach it. How is that propaganda, Matt? Is Pride and Prejudice propaganda? Is the Odyssey or the works of Benjamin Franklin? Did you forget that education is a state's right? Are you saying that each state government and education board collaborated to push To Kill a Mockingbird on the entire country? Is that really more likely than the book simply being a well-written, important cultural American touchstone? Give me a break, Matt. If so many schools agree on To Kill a Mockingbird's place in the classroom, that says more about it than you ever could. If Matt's argument is that To Kill a Mockingbird is propaganda because it's taught in many schools, then doesn't the Bible also qualify as propaganda in the private religious sector? No one in their right mind would make that claim. But also, Matt is very conveniently and egregiously obfuscating the fact that To Kill a Mockingbird has had a controversial history for decades. As early as 1977, the book was challenged and temporarily banned in Minnesota on the basis of vulgar language. Many people have taken every opportunity to challenge this book, to try and get it out of schools and off of shelves, and yet it persists. Maybe Walsh chalks that up to some governmental scheme that bridges the gaps between states. But to me, it's a testament to its quality and importance. If educators and librarians keep going to bat for this book in the face of all its opposition, surely there must be a reason, right? Why is it worth the struggle? I'm willing to bet teachers and librarians know what they're talking about far better than Walsh does. And speaking of Matt, he highlighted some tweets in response to Rand Paul, mocking the question. There's this one that says,
"Disgusting. Leonidas brutally executes Xerxes' emissaries without trial. Hasn't he read To Kill a Mockingbird?" And then there's this one for the Lord of the Rings fans. Quote, "Disgusting. Aragorn brutally executes the mouth of Sauron without trial. Has he read To Kill a Mockingbird?" And then one more. I think we basically get the idea. "Unbelievable. Odysseus cold-heartedly kills the suitors without trial for making sure making sure they're not mentally ill. Has he read To Kill a Mockingbird?"
Now, this bothers me for a few reasons, but first, because Matt said Paul's tweet was an appeal to fiction. But is that not what these tweets are as well? Are these people not also using fiction to try and bolster a point? I guess it's fine when the people you agree with do it, right, Matt? It's also funny because Walsh criticizes To Kill a Mockingbird for the way it depicts its villains, but come on now, comparing JD Vance to Leonidas, Odysseus, Aragorn? Look at these three next to him and try to honestly make that comparison. Be serious. What's more, these tweets again take it as a given that the 11 Venezuelans were, without a doubt, drug traffickers, and not only that, but worthy of death for their alleged drug trafficking. Also, and maybe this is a small thing, but To Kill a Mockingbird does not exist in any of these people's times or universes. How does this even make sense? If you're so convinced of the Venezuelans' guilt, why not use something like Iron Man and Thanos, a situation where the villain is very obviously guilty and the hero would have actually had the opportunity to read To Kill a Mockingbird? Matt's next claim is that
To Kill a Mockingbird is a scam. Although the story is fictional, it's based on lies.
Oh, okay, so now the fact that it's fictional doesn't matter because any basis it did have in reality is a lie. Pick a side, Matt. It is so tempting to play a clip for everything Matt says in this video, but I should do some paraphrasing. Matt directly calls the book propaganda because it's force-fed to kids, and allegedly part of an effort to teach kids that, quote, America is a racist country with a racist past. So I suppose Matt believes that America is not a racist country and doesn't have a racist past, right? America had and currently has many systemic barriers that keep non-white folks from the privileges enjoyed by white people. For example, in the case of To Kill a Mockingbird and criminal justice, even in 2022, the National Registry of Exonerations found the risk of a wrongful conviction in cases where the victim was white is nearly twice that of cases where the victim was black. Racial disparities are even worse for sexual assault crimes, where researchers found that black people are 8 times more likely to be wrongly convicted than a white person for a crime involving sexual violence. Again, the study found the risk of a wrongful conviction increases dramatically if the victim is white as opposed to a person who is black. The report reveals that racial disparities are most extreme in cases involving drug crimes. Black people are 19 times more likely to be wrongly convicted of a drug crime than white people, according to the report. The fact is, black people have always been unfairly targeted and prosecuted by the law in the United States. It doesn't take a genius to see that. That's kind of my problem with Rand Paul's tweet. To Kill a Mockingbird isn't really about a lack of due process, it's more about how even a system like due process can be corrupted by prejudice. Tom Robinson does get a trial, but it is not a fair trial, is it? And let's keep that thought in mind as we continue with Walsh's claims.
Yes, that's the twist. The white girl is the sexual aggressor against the black man. Bet you didn't see that coming. Unless you were a smart kid in school and you knew that, well, like every book that deals with race, if we're reading it in school, the white person is always going to be the villain. Every single one, every single book.
Guess Matt never read Their Eyes Were Watching God or Things Fall Apart, where there are antagonists, villains, and bad people who are black. What a shocker. Moreover, every character in Mockingbird is quite nuanced, except for maybe Bob Ewell. It's not like every black character in the book is a saint. Also, you can call this nitpicking, but I had to point it out.
But Atticus Finch, a man of great moral character, presents a defense. He points out, for example, that Tom Robinson's left arm had been caught in a cotton gin, leaving him with a severe physical disability. Specifically, his left arm was useless and also 12 inches shorter than his right arm. Atticus Finch, being the clever attorney that he is, used this fact to demonstrate that Tom couldn't possibly have beaten the girl since she was mostly hit on the right side of her face. Supposedly that makes some kind of sense, even though, there are ways of beating someone on the other side of the face from where your good hand is.
Matt is correct. There are ways for a right-handed man to hit someone on the right side of their face, but that's not the entirety of the claim. As Mayella says during the trial, he got me round the neck, cussing me and saying dirt. I fought and hollered, but he had me round the neck. He hit me again and again. So the claim is that Tom both had Mayella around the neck and hit her at the same time, which would obviously be impossible for Tom since his left arm is completely non-functional. Mayella later amends that claim, with Atticus's help, mind you, but her story still doesn't add up, as if Tom had to let go of her to hit her, why didn't she run? Or if she was screaming as she claimed, why didn't her siblings come running to her? So either Matt did not understand any of this, or he's willfully misrepresenting the book's contents to further his own agenda. Matt then claims all the white people in Alabama in the book are portrayed as racists who aren't capable of independent thought. He also says he got his plot summary off Wikipedia, but apparently he didn't even read till the end of that.
Really, really bad white people doing really bad white people stuff. That's the book. That's what the book's about.
That is what the book is about? Again, it's so transparent. No mention of the kids at the center of the book, no mention of Sheriff Tate, no mention of Judge Taylor, no mention of Boo Radley. Just such a dishonest lens around which to frame this book. It tells me that Matt either never read it, never finished it, never understood it, or is lying about it. What's even funnier is that Matt says everyone is familiar with the broad outline of the book, but apparently he is not. Matt totally misrepresents this book. Granted, a lot of people do, in large part because of the movie, I suspect. But if you had never heard of this book, then listened to Matt's summary, then read the first 99 pages, you would be confused out of your mind. Tom Robinson isn't even named until page 100, and he doesn't even speak until page 206. Sure, a lot of the plot revolves around him, but a lot of it really doesn't, to be honest. A lot of the book is just about growing up in Alabama, which does include the racial factors at play. I might even argue the book is more about Boo Radley than it is about Tom Robinson. Matt then gets into one of the inspiring forces behind the book, but just one of them. In 1919, before Harper Lee was born, the man who would be her father, Amasa Coleman Lee, was appointed to defend Frank and Brown Ezel in court. The two black men were accused of killing a white store owner who only had one arm. Now, Matt basically says he finds this insensitive.
So in other words, Harper Lee was inspired by true events, which, you might have heard about that in school, except she was inspired to completely invert these true events and make it so that the sympathetic person with one functioning arm wasn't the white victim who was murdered, but instead was the black suspect.
So now it's a problem when fiction writers write fiction, Matt? But let's set that aside for a moment because there are other problems with this. For one thing, just like the Venezuelans who were killed, Matt takes it as a given that the Ezels absolutely were guilty of murdering this store owner. But he doesn't know that for a fact. You could say, but Jonah, they were convicted in a court of law. And while that would be true, remember how I was saying a big part of To Kill a Mockingbird is to demonstrate how the system is prejudiced? Well, one thing that Matt mentions but does not emphasize is the fact that Amasa Lee had never worked a criminal trial before. He had no criminal experience. Matt even says in his video that it was not uncommon for inexperienced lawyers to take on cases like this because nobody else wanted them. How is that not an example of systemic injustice, Matt? Does that sound fair? And Matt doesn't mention how one of the victim's sons was on the jury. Does that sound like a fair trial? And another thing Matt fails to mention is how there was a lynch mob outside the county jail seeking to hang the Ezels before their day in court. Why didn't you mention those details, Matt? Oh, also, going back to the note about fiction, Tom Robinson is not the only character in this book with a messed up arm. That's kind of a big recurring motif in the book, Matt. Harper Lee opens the book by teasing how Jem's arm was badly broken at the elbow. So badly broken that his left arm ended up shorter than his right as he grew old. As I said, this visual representation of imbalance is an obvious motif in the book. And it doesn't just affect the black characters, Matt. At least watch the thug notes the next time you make a video about another classic. Matt also says the younger suspect confessed to his role in the murder, but I cannot for the life of me find the source for that claim. And of course, the Daily Wire certainly did not link to any sources in the description. Oh, but if you want to buy some Matt Walsh merch, including his candles? Don't worry, the Daily Wire's got your back. One last thing on this point. Matt says,
This was not a case where Harper Lee's dad did anything heroic or impressive.
really, it was not heroic or impressive to try and defend two people whom a lynch mob wanted dead. What on earth do you know about heroism or impressiveness, Matt? Matt says this whole 1919 case isn't part of the book's mythology, and yeah, I never heard about it in school. But it's literally on the Wikipedia page for To Kill a Mockingbird. And on top of the 1919 case, there are so many other inspirations listed for this book, including the case of Walter Lett, a black man who was falsely accused of rape, and the case of the Scottsboro Boys and Emmett Till. Matt's last line of offense against this book is Harper Lee's pseudo-sequel, Go Set a Watchman. This book is controversial for a few reasons, and we'll get into all of it, but first, let me just say, this is kind of a weird move to make. There are a lot of classics that have sequels we don't often talk about or that people don't even know about, such as Catch-22 or Things Fall Apart. Regardless of the quality of those book sequels, they still persist in classrooms to this day, so why should Mockingbird be any different? If you know your Harper Lee history, or if you've just read the Wikipedia page for To Kill a Mockingbird, as Matt claims to have done, then you know that Watchmen was actually the first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird. I had actually never read it, so along with rereading Mockingbird for this video, I listened to the Go Set a Watchman audiobook, and its status as a first draft is evident. In the very first chapter, there are passages that are clearly just worse versions of final passages that would end up in To Kill a Mockingbird. Watchman sees Scout returning to Maycomb after her years away at college. She reunites with her boyfriend, a man named Hank, who was a friend of Jem's, who is dead, by the way. Yeah, Jem is dead in the sequel. Atticus is 70, Aunt Alexandra still hangs around the house all the time, Calpurnia is no longer in Atticus's employ, having left when Jem died, and Uncle Jack is far more present around Maycomb. One reason people find Watchmen so controversial is because it paints Atticus as a racist. He's part of what is essentially a white supremacist group. I understand why a lot of people have a problem with this. Having read both books back to back, it absolutely feels like character assassination. Yet, that's surprisingly one of the more redeemable aspects of this book. Some of the big ideas in here actually astonished me with how relevant they are today, especially for a book that was written in the 50s. What do I mean by that? Well, I think there's power in a story that's all about disillusionment. Realizing that the past wasn't actually as good as we thought it was. There's poignancy in a story about the dangers of hero worship. If Lee had written this book when it was actually published, I'd be tempted to read it as a meta-critique of how we propped up Atticus as something of a god when he was only ever just a man. Harper Lee wrote a book about becoming your own person, about the difficulty in cutting off family members with unhealthy, destructive, harmful beliefs, about the dog whistles and ludicrousness of eugenics and the Great Replacement theory, about looking to the past as a means of justifying the terribleness of the present. It's genuinely kind of amazing when looking at it from our present-day lens. The only problem? This book is so boring. Yeah, let's get into it. All the problems with Go Set a Watchman. Don't get me wrong, there are a few stretches in Mockingbird that are also pretty boring, but the number of boring segments in Mockingbird is equal to the number of exciting segments in Watchmen. It's a shorter book, but it was such a slog to get through. Jeez. It is absolutely possible to have a plot that successfully meanders. I honestly think Mockingbird is a pretty good example of that. There's a lot of ambling in that book. Whereas in Watchmen, it almost always feels like nothing is happening. And when something does happen, it is so drawn out. What really gets me is the story's ending. Scout confronts Atticus about how he wasn't the man she thought he was. He says all sorts of things to try and justify his stance. He says he's willing to have his mind changed at his age, even though he's definitely not. Does that sound familiar? He encourages Scout to go read up on what the Founding Fathers really believed. Does that sound familiar? And it's honestly so interesting because it raises questions of the Constitution as a living document, and whether this country was intended to change or remain as founded. grounded, etc., etc. And after their conversation, Scout decides she's done. She's going to leave Maycomb, leave the Finches, and move on with her life. And it's honestly heartbreaking, but at the same time you're rooting for her. You feel her pain, but you're excited to see where she will go. Until Uncle Jack comes along, slaps her twice across the face, calls her a bigot for being unwavering in her beliefs, and convinces her to be the bigger person. What? What an absolutely tone-deaf thing to publish, even in 2015. It would be one thing if the narrative portrayed Jack as wrong, but no. Based on how the rest of the book plays out and how Scout reacts, Uncle Jack is framed as totally correct. It's kind of mind-boggling. It shocks you that this is the same Harper Lee who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. And another thing, this book is written in third-person omniscient, whereas the first book was written in first-person limited. An odd choice for a sequel, but one that an author could get away with, at least in theory. The problem is, Lee does a bit of head-hopping. We're supposed to be with Scout the whole way through, even if it is a third-person narration. But there are brief moments where we enter other people's perspectives. Head-hopping was a little more acceptable back in the day, but usually it's at its best when it's consistent. Here, it just gives off those major first draft vibes. That's not the only inconsistency in this book. There are multiple things that really discredit this as a true sequel to Mockingbird. This is a small one, but Scout says it early on. She says she never swore in front of Atticus as a kid, which, no, obviously false. The story goes that Lee sent this draft of the book to an editor who told her the story would work better if it focused on the narrator as a child. That makes perfect sense to me. The moments I was most engaged in this book were during the flashback sequences, especially with Scout, Jem, and Dill as children. Dill, by the way, is only ever seen as a child in this book. Like Jem, we never see him truly grown up. So it doesn't surprise me that schools don't teach this book, despite the relevance of its big ideas. Assigned readings are already hard enough for students. Mockingbird is actually one of the few school books that actually feels pretty gripping, while its ugly stepbrother just doesn't. To Kill a Mockingbird is genuinely so funny. Writing children is such a hard thing to do, and Lee did it so undeniably well. Scout is an amazing narrator, and it's so fascinating how we join her as she watches Jem growing up. But she just can't quite comprehend what's happening to him. It's wildly interesting. Matt, however, thinks Go Set a Watchman completely destroys the legacy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and the fact that no one talks about it is, in his mind, his ace in the hole. And I get it, for a lot of people, Watchman does ruin the legacy of Mockingbird. One thing I haven't even mentioned is how Harper Lee probably did not want this published, but the people around her who wanted money basically took advantage of her aged state and published it anyway, or so the reports go. But either way, the so-called sequel still ruined the original for some folks. I hope we can all take a more nuanced view though, including you, Matt. Obviously, Watchmen did not and does not ruin the legacy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Because we're still talking about and reading To Kill a Mockingbird, we can analyze both of these pieces of art, together and separately, and come to conclusions about both of them, together and separately. Let's frame it like this. If you found out a great person like MLK had some skeletons in his closet, would you throw out everything MLK ever said? Or, to hear Matt tell it,
We don't ignore their flaws because no man should have his moral failings ignored. We allow criticism because every man deserves criticisms for the evil that he commits, even if he's dead. That doesn't make it any better. If MLK condoned and participated in rapes and orgies and things like that, just because he's dead, that doesn't change the evil of those acts, and they still deserve to be condemned. But we also recognize the greatness of their achievements, and we recognize that these are all men who did things that we could not do.
Funny how Matt understands nuance when it's convenient for him to do so. Also, his words are even more painfully ironic, given certain recent events, but regardless. I agree with you, Matt. If Go Set a Watchman is bad, we can acknowledge that and point it out. But at the same time, we recognize the greatness and achievements of To Kill a Mockingbird, and recognize that Harper Lee did something that we could not do. So he concludes his video by telling Rand Paul and people like him to go read Watchmen. But frankly, I'm not even convinced Matt has read it. I'm not sure if I'm convinced he's read Mockingbird either, but maybe that's unsurprising since he says this.
Really, neither book is worth reading, and none of this matters. In particular, To Kill a Mockingbird is not based in reality. It's not an accurate reflection of life in Alabama during the Great Depression. It's not even an accurate reflection of what Harper Lee's father experienced during the Great Depression.
First of all, it's not supposed to be an accurate reflection of her father's life, because Atticus is not Amasa Coleman Lee. Atticus is a fictional character. Scout is a fictional character, no matter how much is borrowed from Harper Lee's life. You're making two contradictory claims here, Matt. Oh, it's a fictional book, but if it wasn't fiction, it wouldn't be accurate. Are you hearing yourself? But second of all, what do you mean it's not an accurate reflection of life in Alabama during the Great Depression? How would you even know that? Were you there? Are you a historian? I didn't think so. So please, shut your mouth about things you obviously don't know about. You take a lot of pride in the fact that you can read, as do I. So maybe go read this article from the New York Historical about the book and the Great Depression. Matt concludes by calling Mockingbird a poorly written book, backing that claim up with, surprise, nothing. And again leaves me doubting that he's even read the book at all. So why this tirade? Why this effort to try and discredit and denigrate Harper Lee's work? And remember, this all sprang up from Rand Paul's tweet about the Trump administration taking an undoable step over a dangerous line. It was like Matt was just waiting to make a video like this, frothing at the mouth. Maybe Matt is just mad because he knows Mockingbird is far more significant and true than anything he will ever do or create. But more likely, I think that Matt simply hates To Kill a Mockingbird because it does paint an accurate picture of 1930s America. And he can't have that. He cannot honestly confront the systemic racism in America's past or present, whether because of his audience or because of who he is, and I'm honestly not sure which is worse. Now, I should remind myself and all of you that To Kill a Mockingbird isn't a perfect book. It has areas worthy of critique, and it has reasonable controversies surrounding it. One thing I go back and forth on all the time is the characterization of Bob Ewell. I can't decide whether he undermines the book's message or whether his characterization is necessary because there are people out there like him. Another thing that leaves me wanting is the characterization of some of the black characters. Calpurnia is for sure the most fleshed out of all of them, and even she leaves me wanting more. And that's not to mention Tom Robinson, his wife, or Reverend Sykes. And that sort of moves us into the main controversy of the book. The fact that a white woman is so lauded for writing about racism that she never personally experienced. Punctuating that controversy is the Atticus Finch Monument at the Monroe County Courthouse, a place where they could have put a monument to, you know, an actual person who fought for civil rights, or Harper Lee herself at the very least. Like, what does Atticus care that this monument exists? Granted, this is just another testament to how deeply fiction can impact us. I think it's ideal to couple the book today with literature by black authors, like the previously mentioned Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, a story that takes place in the same time period as Mockingbird. Even so, To Kill a Mockingbird persists. I'm not saying the controversies and criticisms aren't legitimate, but for now, the book has a place in our canon, and I truly think it's as relevant today as ever. And speaking of which, seeing as Matt either hasn't read, finished, or understood this book, I decided to pick out some quotes that I thought would be especially relevant to him. But let's face it, considering his comprehension of the book, there's no way he made it this far into this video. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. Mockingbirds don't do one thing but make music for us to enjoy. They don't eat people's gardens, don't nest in corn cribs, they don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. This case, Tom Robinson's case, is something that goes to the essence of a man's conscience. Scout, I couldn't go to church and worship God if I didn't try to help that man. Well, most folks seem to think they're right and you're wrong. They're certainly entitled to think that, and they're entitled to full respect for their opinions, said Atticus. But before I can live with other folks, I've got to live with myself. The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience. There's something in our world that makes men lose their heads. They couldn't be fair if they tried. In our courts, when it's a white man's word against a black man's, the white man always wins. They're ugly, but those are the facts of life. As you grow older, you'll see white men cheat black men every day of your life. But let me tell you something, and don't you forget it. Whatever a white man does to a black man, no matter who he is, how rich he is, or how fine a family he comes from, that white man is trash. Nah, Jim, I think there's just one kind of folks. Folks. If there's just one kind of folks, why can't they get along with each other? If they're all alike, why do they go out of their way to despise each other? Atticus was right. One time he said you never really know a man until you stand in his shoes and walk around in them. Alright, we'd better leave it there. This video is long enough. It's not every day that political pundits talk about classic literature, and based on how well Matt Walsh did here, I'm sure you can see why. But hey, what did you think of this video? Do you think Matt made any decent points? What do you think of To Kill a Mockingbird? Have you read its sequel? Please, tell me everything. If you want to see videos like this early, consider supporting me on Patreon. You'll also get access to the community Discord and receive priority review for your work over on the second channel. You're seeing my patrons' names on screen right now, and I genuinely can't thank them enough. If you want to support in other important ways, please do all the things the algorithm likes. There's this new thing called hyping or hype points or something. I don't know, I'm really not certain of how it works, but feel free to hype this video if you want to. You can also follow me on my socials, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft. Also, on a totally unrelated note, you ever see someone with like the most smug, punchable face you've ever seen? Then again, maybe I'm one to talk.